Very much, and firstly, of course, to thank Ian and Gladys and the Chile Explore team for putting on such a great day. We're only halfway through with another day to come tomorrow. And certainly thanks to them for slotting in an IOCG session today. We're often the smaller sibling compared to the giant porphyry deposits in Chile, so it's good to have some talk about the IOCG deposits today. Look, I'd like to talk about what we're doing at the La Higuera IOCG project. It's essentially it's an old historic mining district, but we're applying some, I guess some new thinking and discovering a lot more copper through that district, which is being very encouraging. So just some forward-looking statements. I may say things that may or may not happen in the future, so don't invest on that basis, please. I won't talk much about this, the Chilean coastal IOCG belt. We've seen it on several slides. This is just really as a location map to show you that in the north, you'll see the Tribeca Resources there. And that's basically where we work, and we have a new project, Chiricuto, which is sitting in between Manto Verde and Santo Domingo. And then down in the south here, is where I'm going to be talking about our La Higuera project. It's located down there near the Dominga, El Tofo and El Romeral deposits. So the Atacama Fault System, I guess starting with Irani, initially the first speaker of this IOCG session, followed by just about everybody else has mentioned the Atacama Fault System. And so we're working along that. You'll see on this map there is the outline of the property that we're working on, and it's essentially located along the Atacama Fault System. Now, to the south of the properties, you'll see that the Atacama Fault System runs down towards the El Romeral mine, and it's approximately a north-south system there, and it's often termed the Romeral Fault System. But then once you get north of those properties, you start to see that the Atacama Fault System essentially starts to become to a north-northeast orientation. And it's often termed the Tofo Fault System up through that area. So we're essentially working at the break in the change between the north-south and the north-northeast trending Atacama Fault System. And to add the geology to that structural framework, you'll see that out to the west of the Atacama Fault System, we have these units in blue, which is essentially probably the La Negra and Cobre Formation equivalents down to the south here, and they also continue down to the south. Across the Atacama Fault System, to the east are the slightly younger intrusive rocks, 130 to 105, and the intrusive rocks out to the west are a little bit older, as we expect. So we're working around the La Higuera Historic Mining Centre. Now, it was, back in the days in the 1800s, actually the world's largest copper producer at certain points. And it was mining some very high-grade underground material, 5 to 8% copper, chalcopyrite essentially. And that was either being smelted on site or shipped directly across to the UK to be smelted. Now, why I've shown this is we're not working in the La Higuera Historic Mining Centre, but what we're trying to do is take the lessons from that centre and apply them undercover in the district. So a very important part of that is the geophysical data sets and what La Higuera looks like in the geophysics. So this is an oblique view. You'll see the town of La Higuera, and up to the south here, this is looking to the east. Up to the south here on the hill, there are many open pits that are currently they currently come back to action when the copper price goes up and some oxide copper is mined. But there is also a large tunnel, the Munoz Adit, that comes in under the hill. It's about 1 kilometre long. So that's just to give you a reference of what this is. So we'll step through a couple of slides showing the geophysical data and what it looks like, all from the same view. So this is the magnetic data, and you can see the Munoz Adit coming in under the hill, and so a very strong magnetic signature associated with the La Higuera mineralization. Then we'll put up the chargeability. This is pole-dipole chargeability sections, inversions. and you'll see that the chargeability is very obviously tied to the mineralisation, which has the adit running through it here. This is the resistivity sections on the same zone, and you'll see that again the resistivity is tied very nicely to the mineralisation. You'll see the purple is the lower resistivity, and out of the picture you'll see some very large low resistivity zones, and they are essentially the gravel cover. So just to put on the MVI magnetic inversion of magnetic susceptibility here, and you'll see it very nicely ties in with the resistivity data. So what we can say is that if we're looking at the geophysical data signature of the La Higuera mineralisation, it is a strong magnetic anomaly, a very strong chargeability anomaly, and a slightly more subtle low resistivity anomaly. So I wanted to talk mainly about the Gabby IOCG system, where we've been doing our drilling. This is that same map of the geology here, and you'll see with the ground magnetic data shown here. This is the main magnetic anomaly to the east. Here is the La Higuera mineralisation. Then we have the Gabby system where we've been drilling that I'm going to talk about, and then we have some other targets down to the south that we're working up into drill targets. Now, you might notice on this diagram that there is this fault that runs around the eastern side of the San Juan Pluton, and it trends to the northeast here. It turns around and it comes to the northwest and has a very strong control on the La Higuera mineralisation, and then it comes out through this alteration system and cover and meets the Atacama fault system out here. So just to highlight that structure. So this is what we've been doing at Gabby. We've drilled, there's 10,000 metres in total. We've drilled 6 holes, that's 6,000 metres of that. And you'll see that we've now had drilling over a 2 kilometre length, and 1.5 of those kilometres has copper mineralisation. Now the thickness varies, the true thickness varies from about 30 metres at the south to 130 metres up in this northern section. So it's relatively thick, steeply dipping zone of mineralisation, and we've drilled it quite a long section, but we find that the grades are varying from 0.66 here, 260 metres at 0.66 and 0.14 copper with that. Down to sort of 0.3, 0.2 and 0.1. So it's relatively variable grades along strike, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing I should point out on this diagram is these blue zones, this is an old geological map, are the outcropping areas, and the yellow is the covered areas. Okay. So this is just a long section here from south to north. What we're seeing is the drilling. And you'll see that these shells are actually the inversion of the magnetic susceptibility. So it's quite interesting. The drilling here, we're looking to the east, is colour-coded by copper. So that you'll see that the highest copper grades actually sit here in the middle with some of them up to the north as well. And what we see is that the very strong magnetite section down to the south does not have a lot of copper. Very high iron, but not so much copper. Then as we move off to the north, we start to see some more copper, and the highest grades are actually not with the very high magnetite zones, but a little bit further north. So let's get to some of the rocks. What do the rocks look like? I guess there's not a lot of outcrop, but what we see, we I guess try and define a distal versus a proximal alteration system. And these are cobbles, but they're basically what the outcrop looks like. And you can see that this one on the left is a breccia, angular type class of diorite and andesite, often altered. And you'll see the matrix here is essentially scapolite and albite, very strong alteration. As well, you see these heavy veins. This is pretty much, that'll all be actinolite. As you move from Gabby to the old La Higuera workings, we're potentially moving up temperature, and you start to see some pyroxene entering into that assemblage. So it's very heavily veined and brecciated. So that's sort of the distal assemblage. And then we have the few outcrops that are near the system that we've been drilling, and the main difference is we start to see iron oxide coming into the system, okay? So you can see some veins here, that's iron oxide. It would have been magnetite, and the white selvage to that is an albite dominated selvage, and you may see epidote as well in these systems. And of course, as you get close to the system, you start to see a little bit of oxide copper coming into the ferruginous weathered units. So that's sort of the bit of outcrop that we see. So what do the fresh rocks look like in core? Andesite, 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 and yet more andesite. So it's in looking at the contrast that Giancarlo was talking about from the structurally controlled Manto Verde to the more strata-controlled Santo Domingo, we're very much at the structurally controlled andesite. We don't see a lot of, well, we don't see any real sort of volcanoclastic units here. It's all andesite. So we think it's a very structurally controlled system. Relatively homogeneous, but you will see this diagram on the right is a megacrystic andesite. The plagioclase phenocrysts are sometimes altered to, or often altered to sericite, and you'll also see some pyrite plus or minus chalcopyrite mineralisation in that. So we interpret that as being a late intrusive. We do see the odd small fine-grained diorite through the system as well. So that's the host rocks, the alteration. We do have some early biotite magnetite, very fine-grained, but it's relatively restricted in its distribution, and we don't think it's overly important. We do the main alteration is I guess a calcic alteration, actinolite, magnetite, often with pyrite, some scapolite veins, calcic sodic type of alteration. And then, as you see on the right there, that can become more intense, and obviously your veining is increasing. And you'll see that we have some green zones here, which will be actinolite dominated, and then the darker zones are the magnetite replacing the host rock. And this section on the right is almost totally replaced, and the texture will often be totally destroyed through that alteration. So the mineralisation, what does it look like? The mineralisation is totally, the copper mineralisation is totally dominated by chalcopyrite. The pyrite to chalcopyrite ratio is typically high, so we do have a lot of pyrite, and we see that in the geophysical data, the chargeability. So it's pretty much all chalcopyrite. We see a little bit of bornite and a little bit of chalcocite, but it's very heavily chalcopyrite dominated. So what we think, and we had I had a guy called Nick Oliver who's from HCOV Consultants, who's done a lot of work on IOCG systems, come out here and have a good look, and we didn't quite appreciate it until he shed a bit more light on it. But it really looks like there are about 2 associations here. And the first association, you see these, you see some slight evidence of ductile textures. You can see some of them there marked in green, some boudinaging on this vein. And this is very much, you'll see the assemblage there, magnetite, scapolite, albite, quartz, and amphibole. So really a dominant assemblage, and we see that through the system, and we think it's relatively early, hence association 1. And then association 2 is what carries most of the copper. And you'll see there it's basically late magnetite sulfides. And it is typically relatively coarse-grained. So that you'll see these large veins up here in the top section. This middle piece of core is dominated by, this is actually chalcopyrite magnetite. I think something like a vein or a breccia that's been rebrecciated, and then very late open space textures with some calcite crystals on the outside of them. And locally, we find that the sulfides are semi-massive to massive. So in this case, this is essentially chalcopyrite, and interesting, a lot of pyrrhotite with that as well, plus pyrite. So it's quite a curiosity. And so that's a sort of a semi-massive to massive 8-metre thick section of mineralisation. I should say that looking at this as well, there is a very, very, very consistent relationship between copper and gold, which is typically about 4 to 1. So if you have 0.4 copper, you will have about 0.1 gold. So it's very, very consistent. There is also obviously magnetite and cobalt, as we've seen in some of the other IOCG deposits, is highly anomalous. So we're typically in the 200 to 300 ppm range. So just having a quick look at, I guess, the general zonation of some of the major elements. This plot up here is potassium, sodium and calcium, and there's been just a very general clustering run on that to give us our calcic, potassic and sodic alteration. And you can see that that is plotted up here on the drilling, okay? From south up to the top is the north. And so you can see a sort of a broad distribution of the sodic clusters in the north, the potassic in the center zone, and then the calcic down in the south, but also over here in these holes off to the east. Now, the high-grade mineralisation here sits pretty much through this area, sort of overlapping the potassic and the calcic alteration. So the potassic, I haven't spoken much, but the potassic assemblage consists pretty much of the fine-grained biotite, and there's a bit of K-feldspar as well. So that's looking at the alteration and the mineralisation. But the one other thing that I wanted to touch on is the structural controls on the mineralisation. So our first phase of drilling was not oriented, unfortunately, but our second phase of drilling we did, and we had a young geologist essentially full-time just taking structural measurements. So we have a database of 7,000 measurements from sort of 3,800 metres of core, and he was measuring veins and fractures and faults and any intrusive contacts, etc., that he could find. And the results were pretty interesting. So this is magnetite veins only, okay? And so what you can see there, this is poles to veins, so that so that you can see the two clusters of poles. So this is a stereo plot, and you can see that this sort of north-northeast trending, almost sub-vertical, a little east dipping is the set of magnetite veins. And that sort of roughly ties in with the north-south magnetite system that we've been drilling. But then you plot up the copper data, and it's entirely different. So the poles here, there are two stereo plots. The one on the left is all structures within intervals that are 0.25% copper or higher. And then this right stereo plot is all structures that contain chalcopyrite. And they tend to be sort of relatively similar. But what it's showing us is that these copper veins have a propensity to be west striking and dipping down to the southwest, which is clearly different to the data we're getting from the magnetite veins. Whether they represent the enveloping envelopes for the bodies, we don't know, but they do tie in with the association 1 magnetite pyrite and the association 2 the coarse-grained copper sulfides. So very interesting, and we're planning our next phase of drilling on the basis of a lot of this data, so that we ensure that we're targeting the higher zones correctly, the higher grade zones correctly. Finally, metallurgical test work. I guess we've heard copper, gold, cobalt and magnetite. There was some historical work done back in the late 2000s, and there was a copper-gold concentrate stripped off, floated off. You'll see there good recoveries, etc. But then the interesting stuff happened, and the tails were then put through magnetic separation, and you'll see there produced a magnetite 69.4% iron concentrate, and then also the rougher tailings had a pyrite concentrate floated off the top that had 0.4% cobalt in it. So obviously the cobalt is associated with the pyrite, which is, I guess, what we pretty much know. So in summary, the La Higuera system itself, it's a district yielding additional copper systems despite having a lot of historic mining. It's polymetallic, copper, gold, iron and cobalt. It's strongly magnetite dominated to date that we've been intersecting. We do see a little musketovite and specularite variably through the deposit, perhaps a little more in the north, so that maybe that sort of zonation to potentially cooler or more oxidized setting. And then in terms of the approach, it's a very strong geophysical approach undercover, under the gravel covers, which we're finding is working well. The magnetics seems to be more key than the IP data. And finally, I guess we're learning what we should all know, which is extraction of maximum data from drilling. So that when you're working undercover, you really need to get all that you can from the drilling. So I guess that's a bit of advice, and we're trying to push that aspect now. That's all. I'll finish there. I hope you know a little bit more about the La Higuera system and how we're operating there, and it might provide some insights into some of the things that you're seeing elsewhere. So thank you very much, everybody.